The story of Samson is one of the most remarkable and challenging accounts in the Bible, a story that captures both the height of human strength and the depth of human weakness. His life raises a question that continues to echo across generations. Why did a man so uniquely chosen by God, a man gifted with extraordinary power, reveal the secret of his strength? This question is not only about Samson himself, but about the struggles we all face, the moments when temptation presses in and we risk surrendering what should be guarded. Samson's life was not just about muscle and might. It was about calling, devotion, and the fragile nature of the human heart. He was chosen before birth, consecrated as a Nazirite, and entrusted with a mission to deliver Israel from its enemies. Yet alongside his victories stood failures that remind us of the tension between divine purpose and human desire. His strength was extraordinary, but it was always tied to his devotion to God, and when that devotion was compromised, so was his power. What makes Samson's story so compelling is that it mirrors our own battles in life. Every person has been given strengths, gifts, and opportunities, yet those blessings can be weakened when devotion is neglected and temptation is entertained. Samson was undone not by the armies of the Philistines, but by his inability to guard what was sacred. His life is a reminder that the greatest battles are often not against external enemies, but within the heart itself. As we begin this journey through Samson's story, we are invited to see more than history. We are invited to see ourselves. His victories show us what God can do through a life set apart, and his failures warn us of the dangers when devotion is taken lightly. The question of why Samson revealed his secret is not just about him. It is about how we handle the sacred trust God places in each of us, and whether we choose to guard it or surrender it. This introduction is not only about Samson's struggles, but also about the hope his story carries. Even in his greatest failures, God's mercy still worked. His life was a mixture of triumph and tragedy, but through it all, we see the hand of God reminding us that strength is never our own. It is always entrusted, and it must always be guarded. Before we go deeper, I want to encourage you to stay connected with this channel. If you enjoy reflections like these and want to hear more biblical insights that challenge, inspire, and encourage, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if this message speaks to you, consider sharing it with those close to you so they too can discover the lessons hidden in the story of Samson. Samson's story begins long before his own decisions shaped the course of his life. From the very beginning, God marked him for a special purpose. An angel of the Lord appeared to his mother, a woman unable to bear children, and declared that she would conceive and give birth to a son. This was not only a promise of life, but a revelation of destiny. The child was to be a Nazirite from birth, consecrated to God in a unique way, set apart to carry out the work of delivering Israel from the Philistines, who at that time oppressed the people with relentless cruelty. The Nazirite vow was not a simple tradition, but a sacred calling. It demanded a life of separation from common pleasures and impurities. Those who undertook it abstained from wine and anything produced from the vine, avoided touching dead bodies to remain ceremonially clean, and never cut their hair, which became the visible sign of their devotion. In Samson's case, this vow was not voluntary or temporary but permanent, established by divine command even before he entered the world. His very existence was bound to this covenant, and his hair, which he was never to cut, became the outward symbol of his inward consecration. This consecration carried both privilege and responsibility. Samson's extraordinary strength was not a product of his own effort or natural ability, but a gift tied to his calling. His power was a visible manifestation of God's presence upon him, given not for personal gain, but for the deliverance of Israel. Every time he performed an act of incredible strength, it testified that God had chosen him, that his life was set apart for a greater purpose. Yet this also meant that his failures carried heavier consequences, for to neglect the vow was not merely to disobey a command, but to disregard the sacred covenant that defined his identity. To be a Nazirite from birth also meant that Samson was different from those around him. He could not live like others, indulge in what they enjoyed, or blend into the surrounding culture. His consecration marked him out as separate, and this separation was meant to protect him, to keep him focused on the divine purpose for which he was created. Yet, as we will see throughout his life, Samson often struggled with this tension. The desire to live as he wished clashed with the restrictions of his vow, and this inner conflict would later play a significant role in his downfall. The Nazirite vow served as a constant reminder of God's ownership over Samson's life. His uncut hair was not magical in itself, but it was a visible sign that his strength depended entirely on his devotion to God. As long as the vow remained unbroken, God's power rested upon him. The moment it was betrayed, his strength would depart. This truth reveals a powerful lesson. The source of strength in life is not found in personal ability, wealth, or reputation, but in faithfulness to the calling God has placed upon each person. God often sets people apart long before they realize the fullness of what that means. Samson's story shows that consecration is both a gift and a burden. It brings great blessing, but it also demands responsibility and vigilance. He was destined for greatness, but greatness could only be preserved through obedience. In this way, Samson's vow becomes a mirror of the struggles many face when called to live differently in a world that resists holiness. The significance of Samson's consecration also challenges us to reflect on how sacred commitments are guarded. Boundaries like those in the Nazirite vow are not restrictions for the sake of hardship, but protections to keep the heart aligned with God's will. When Samson honored his vow, he walked in power. When he disregarded it, he invited weakness into his life. The vow stood as a protective wall around his strength, reminding him that devotion to God was the foundation of everything he could accomplish. In the end, Samson's identity as a Nazirite shows that his life was never truly his own. He belonged to God, marked from birth, chosen for a purpose larger than himself. His hair, his vow, his calling, these were not personal possessions to be traded or taken lightly, but sacred trust placed upon him by God. The tragedy of his story is not that he was called, but that he often resisted the weight of that calling, allowing his desires to compete with his devotion. His consecration, if honored, could have made him a man of enduring greatness. Yet his failure to guard it would eventually reveal the cost of neglecting what is most sacred. Samson was unlike any man of his time. His strength was legendary, his feats astonishing, his presence enough to terrify the Philistines who sought to subdue Israel. He ripped apart a lion with his bare hands, carried the gates of a city to the top of a hill, and struck down enemies in numbers that defied reason. His might was not the product of training or weapons, but the Spirit of the Lord resting upon him, making him a living example of God's power at work. Yet alongside this remarkable strength existed a glaring weakness that defined his character as much as his victories. This duality is what makes Samson's story so compelling. Outwardly, he seemed invincible, able to accomplish what no other man could. Inwardly, however, he was fragile, impulsive, and easily swayed by desire. He was a warrior on the battlefield, but often defeated in the quiet struggles of the heart. His life was marked by triumphs that displayed his power and failures that revealed his lack of discipline. This paradox illustrates a truth that applies far beyond his story, that strength in one area does not cancel weakness in another. Samson's downfall was rarely the result of external enemies overpowering him, for none could. His true enemies were the weaknesses within him. His impulses often dictated his choices, whether in anger, attraction, or pride. He was quick to act, often without thought, and the consequences of his actions spread far beyond himself. In this, his story reminds us that unchecked desires can unravel even the strongest of lives, that what is not disciplined within will eventually compromise what is visible without. The tension between his strength and weakness is also a reflection of the human condition. Many people possess remarkable talents, gifts, or successes, yet at the same time wrestle with struggles that remain hidden from view. To the world, they appear strong, but behind closed doors, they face battles that test their endurance in ways no one else can see. Samson embodies this reality. He looked unstoppable to his enemies, yet he was vulnerable to his own lack of control. His weakness was not in his muscles, but in his heart. He allowed passions to guide him rather than his calling. He permitted emotions to dictate his actions rather than the vow that defined him. The strength of his arms could topple enemies, but the weakness of his heart made him prey to temptations he should have resisted. His life shows that true strength is not measured only by what one can do outwardly, but by what one can resist inwardly. Samson's repeated failures reveal the danger of assuming strength will always remain, regardless of choices. He seemed to believe his power would never leave him, that he could indulge his weaknesses without consequence. This assumption blinded him to the reality that strength was tied to obedience. His victories bred confidence, but confidence without humility and discipline became pride, and pride blinded him to the dangers lurking close by. The paradox of Samson's character invites us to examine the places where strength and weakness coexist in our own lives. One can excel in public achievements, yet stumble in private struggles. One can appear confident and capable, yet inwardly feel fragile and divided. Samson's life warns us not to overlook these contradictions, but to confront them, for hidden weaknesses, if ignored, eventually surface with consequences that strength alone cannot overcome. In Samson, we see both the potential for greatness and the peril of neglecting inner battles. He was strong enough to lead, but weak enough to fall. His story serves as both inspiration and warning, reminding us that true strength must be rooted in more than outward ability. It must flow from a heart anchored in devotion, a will disciplined against temptation, and a spirit humble before God. Without this balance, strength becomes fleeting and weakness becomes destructive. Samson's life took a turning point when Delilah entered the story. She was not the first woman to draw his attention, but she became the one whose influence surpassed all others. Samson's attraction to her was immediate, and his attachment grew deep. Yet behind her beauty and charm lay motives that ran directly against his well-being. The Philistine rulers saw in her the perfect tool to achieve what no army had accomplished: the defeat of Samson through the betrayal of his own heart. Delilah approached Samson not with weapons or armies, but with affection and persistence. She spoke to him, pressed him with questions, and drew him in with the intimacy of trust. For a man as powerful as Samson, it was not the battlefield that threatened him, but the quiet influence of someone who sought his secret. His heart, drawn by desire, overlooked the danger, and in that blindness, his strength became vulnerable. The relationship between Samson and Delilah illustrates how attraction and misplaced affection can cloud judgment. He was consecrated to God, marked for a divine purpose, yet he chose to remain close to someone whose loyalty was not with him, but with his enemies. Her repeated attempts to uncover his strength revealed her intentions clearly, but Samson ignored the warning signs, bound by his attachment to her. His heart made him vulnerable in ways no weapon could. This dynamic reveals the power of emotional entanglements. Relationships hold the capacity to strengthen or to destroy, to lead toward purpose or away from it. Samson's devotion to Delilah was not matched by her devotion to him, and this imbalance proved fatal. She sought personal gain, promised wealth and reward if she could betray him, while he sought companionship and love. This uneven foundation opened the door to betrayal. The tragedy of Samson's relationship with Delilah lies in his refusal to walk away. He saw the tests, he recognized the dangers, yet he remained in her presence. His attachment blinded him, convincing him that he could remain close without consequence. But every moment spent with her chipped away at his resolve. Every test she applied drew him closer to surrender. His strength could resist armies, but not the pull of misplaced affection. Delilah symbolizes the subtlety of temptation. She did not come as an enemy, but as a partner, not with hostility, but with tenderness. Yet behind the facade lay the plan of destruction. This mirrors how temptation often works, not as something openly threatening, but as something appealing, familiar, and even desirable. Samson's failure was not recognizing the true nature of what stood before him, mistaking danger for delight. The woman who captured Samson's heart teaches us that the most dangerous battles are not always external, but internal. It was not Philistine soldiers who broke him, but the trust he placed in someone unworthy of it. By giving his heart without discernment, he handed his strength to his enemies. His downfall began not when his hair was cut, but when his affection bound him to Delilah despite her betrayal. Samson's story here warns us to guard carefully what is most sacred. Affection and trust, when placed in the wrong hands, become paths to destruction. Love and attraction are powerful, but without wisdom and discernment, they can lead to ruin. Delilah's presence in Samson's life shows that even the strongest can fall when the heart is given to one who seeks their downfall. Delilah's strategy was not force, but persistence. She pressed Samson again and again to reveal the secret of his strength. At first, he resisted, giving her false answers, each time proving his words untrue when she tested them. Yet she did not stop. Her determination wore on him, not with violence but with constancy. Day after day, her questions chipped away at his resolve until his resistance grew thin. This persistence is a picture of how temptation often operates. It does not always overwhelm in a single moment, but lingers, presses, and waits. Samson was strong enough to resist at first, but the unending repetition weakened him. His fatigue became the opening temptation needed, and his heart, tired of the struggle, chose surrender over resistance. His defeat came not from the power of a single attack, but from the erosion of his will over time. The danger Samson faced was not simply Delilah's persistence, but his choice to remain close to her. Each time she tested him, he had the opportunity to walk away. Each moment revealed her betrayal, yet he stayed. By staying, he gave temptation space to grow stronger, until resisting felt more exhausting than giving in. This reveals a vital truth. Temptation grows most powerful when it is entertained instead of rejected. The gradual nature of Samson's fall is what makes it so sobering. He did not collapse in one moment of weakness, but in many smaller steps that led him to that moment. Persistence chipped away at his resolve until the sacred trust he was meant to guard slipped from his grasp. What armies could not take by force, persistence stole through patience. This reality speaks to the struggles people face daily. Rarely do temptations succeed instantly. More often they return, whispering, pressing, asking, until the heart grows weary. Victory requires more than strength in a single moment. It demands vigilance in every moment. Samson's failure lay not in weakness of body, but in weariness of spirit, a weariness that grew under the constant weight of Delilah's persistence. Delilah's success reveals the subtle danger of underestimating persistence. Samson assumed he could withstand her forever, that his strength would always outlast her efforts. But strength is not infinite when temptation is given constant access. What could have been cut off quickly was instead entertained, and over time, his defenses broke. His downfall shows that what is tolerated today may become overpowering tomorrow. The power of persistence reminds us that victory requires more than a single act of resistance. It requires consistency, vigilance, and the willingness to remove what threatens devotion before it takes root. Samson's example shows the peril of keeping temptation close, believing strength will always prevail. His life proves that persistence can overcome even the strongest when the heart grows weary of resisting. In the end, Samson was not undone by a single blow, but by the slow wearing down of his resolve. Delilah's persistence achieved what no soldier could. His story warns us that true strength is not only in great acts of power, but in the steady discipline of guarding what is sacred day after day. Without vigilance, persistence will always find its way through, and strength, no matter how great, will crumble. The moment that would define Samson's life came after repeated pressure, when the persistence of Delilah finally overcame his will. Tired of her constant demands and the strain of resisting, he disclosed what he was meant to guard above all else. He revealed that his strength was tied to his hair, the symbol of his consecration to God as a Nazirite. In speaking those words, he did not merely give information, he surrendered the sacred trust that God had placed upon him from birth. This act was not simply the sharing of a secret, but the breaking of a covenant. His strength did not come from his hair in a natural sense, but from the vow that the hair represented. By revealing this truth to Delilah, Samson made vulnerable what was meant to remain hidden between himself and God. He gave access to what was holy, exposing the source of his power to someone who had proven her intent to betray him. It was a tragic moment, for Samson did not only hand over knowledge, he handed over his destiny. The danger of his decision lies in the fact that he undervalued what was sacred. He treated the sign of his consecration as though it could be shared without consequence. By doing so, he underestimated the weight of what God had entrusted to him. The tragedy is not only that he lost his strength, but that he failed to recognize the gravity of exposing what was meant to remain protected. Sacred things, once given away, cannot always be recovered in the same way. Samson's revelation shows how easily the sacred can be compromised when temptation is entertained too long. He did not intend to lose everything, yet by remaining in Delilah's presence and allowing her persistence to wear him down, he reached a point where surrender seemed easier than resistance. This is the quiet danger of temptation. It does not always demand outright disobedience at once, but gradually erodes resolve until giving in feels like relief. The betrayal that followed was swift. As Samson slept on Delilah's lap, his hair was cut, and with it, the outward sign of his devotion was removed. When he awoke, he expected to rise as before, to break free from his enemies with strength unshaken. Yet he discovered that the Lord had departed from him, and the power he had taken for granted was gone. His assumption that strength would always remain proved false, for the source of his might was never in himself, but in his consecration to God. This moment stands as a warning about taking God's gifts for granted. Samson believed his strength would never leave, that no matter his choices, the power would still be present. Yet the loss of his hair symbolized the breaking of the vow, and with it, the departure of the Spirit's empowerment. His downfall teaches that God's gifts are not to be treated casually, for when what is sacred is compromised, the consequences are real and lasting. The revelation of his secret was also the revelation of his heart. By telling Delilah, Samson showed where his trust had shifted. Instead of guarding his covenant with God, he chose to place intimacy and confidence in someone who sought his destruction. This misplaced trust revealed that his devotion had been divided, and in that division he lost the very thing that made him unique. His decision illustrates how surrendering sacred trust to the wrong influences leads to devastation. The secret Samson revealed was not simply about hair, but about devotion. It was about the covenant between him and God, the vow that marked him as chosen. When he let go of that, he lost not just his strength, but his identity, his purpose, and his calling. His story at this point becomes a cautionary tale of what happens when what is most precious is given to those who will not honor it. Once Samson revealed the secret of his strength, the consequences unfolded quickly and painfully. The Philistines, who had long feared him, finally subdued him. No longer able to rise in power against them, he was captured with ease. They bound him with bronze shackles, blinded him by gouging out his eyes, and led him away to grind grain in the prison house. The mighty warrior, once feared by nations, became a broken man forced into humiliation. The price of compromise was heavy. Samson lost not only his freedom, but also his sight. He who once saw the path of battle clearly now lived in darkness. This loss symbolizes more than physical blindness. It represents the spiritual blindness that came from ignoring God's commands and choosing desire over devotion. His compromise robbed him of vision, both physically and spiritually, leaving him in chains, powerless and humiliated before his enemies. Compromise often begins in small steps, but ends in devastating consequences. Samson's decision to remain close to Delilah seemed harmless at first, but it opened the door to betrayal. His willingness to entertain temptation cost him the sacred gift God had given him, and once it was gone, his enemies had power over him. What compromise promised as pleasure became his downfall, proving that the cost of disobedience is always greater than imagined. The image of Samson grinding grain in the prison is striking. This once mighty judge of Israel, who had slain thousands, now labored like a beast of burden under the watchful eyes of those who mocked him. It is a picture of how sin binds, blinds, and grinds. It binds the heart with chains, it blinds the mind to truth, and it grinds the soul down with shame and regret. Samson's life became a living illustration of the destructive path compromise creates. His humiliation also served as a warning to Israel. The one they had looked to for deliverance was now powerless because of disobedience. His strength, which once delivered his people, was taken because he failed to remain faithful to the vow God had placed upon him. His life testified that no amount of outward strength can protect against the consequences of a compromised heart. Yet even in this dark moment, Samson's story was not beyond redemption. Though bound and blind, his hair began to grow again. This detail, subtle yet significant, indicated that God had not abandoned him completely. The sign of his consecration was returning, hinting that though Samson had fallen, God's purpose was not entirely lost. Even in failure, there was the possibility of restoration. Samson's captivity highlights the sobering truth that the price of compromise is always far greater than the fleeting pleasure that led to it. His life warns us that sacred trust must be guarded diligently, for once compromised, the consequences cannot be avoided. Yet it also hints that even in failure, God's mercy can begin to work again, preparing the way for redemption that only He can bring. The story of Samson is not just an ancient tale, but a mirror reflecting the struggles people face in every generation. His strength and downfall speak to the condition of the human heart, the battles with temptation, and the importance of guarding what is sacred. When we look at Samson's choices, we see patterns that echo in modern life, for the ways people surrender their strength today are often not so different from the way he surrendered his. One of the first lessons is the danger of undervaluing what God entrusts to us. Samson treated his consecration lightly, as though it could be compromised without consequence. In the same way, many treat integrity, purity, faith, or calling as though these gifts can be bent or ignored without lasting damage. Yet the story shows that when sacred things are not guarded, they can be lost, and their loss carries a heavy price. Another lesson is the subtlety of temptation. Samson was not defeated by armies, but by his attachment to someone who wore down his resolve. Temptation often comes not with open hostility, but with quiet persistence, disguised as something appealing. The repeated pressure of compromise slowly erodes defenses until surrender feels easier than resistance. This reminds us that vigilance must be ongoing, not just in great battles, but in the daily choices that shape our hearts. Samson's story also teaches the importance of where trust is placed. He trusted Delilah, who betrayed him, instead of guarding his devotion to God. In life, misplaced trust can lead to devastating consequences, whether in relationships, ambitions, or pursuits that draw us away from what is true and right. Trust must be rooted in what honors God, for only then is it safe from betrayal. Another striking lesson is that strength without discipline is incomplete. Samson's physical power was unmatched, yet his lack of self-control led to his downfall. This shows that talent, ability, or success cannot replace character. Strength in one area of life cannot compensate for weakness in another. True strength lies in balance, in aligning outward abilities with inward faithfulness. Samson also reveals that sin not only binds, but blinds. His physical blindness mirrored the spiritual blindness that had plagued him long before. He could not see the danger of staying close to Delilah, just as he could not see the value of guarding his vow. This blindness led to captivity, reminding us that ignoring truth always leads to greater darkness. Perhaps the most hopeful lesson is that failure does not end God's ability to work. Even after Samson fell, his hair began to grow again, showing that God's purposes can still rise out of brokenness. His story teaches that while compromise has consequences, redemption is still possible when hearts turn back to God. No failure is final when grace is sought. These lessons apply not only to individuals, but to communities and nations. Samson's life was meant to deliver Israel, yet his personal compromises weakened his calling. Likewise, when sacred trust is abandoned, the effects ripple outward, affecting many beyond the individual. The call is to vigilance, devotion, and faithfulness, to guard the strength God has entrusted and not allow it to be surrendered to the world's persistence. Though Samson fell into deep humiliation, his story did not end in darkness. Captured, blinded, and mocked, he seemed utterly defeated, yet in this lowest point, something began to change. Stripped of everything he once relied upon, he turned back to the God who had chosen him. In the house of his enemies, surrounded by those who celebrated his downfall, Samson cried out to the Lord one last time, asking for strength not for personal glory, but to bring judgment upon the Philistines. This moment marks a turning point. Samson, who had often used his strength recklessly, finally sought it with humility. He recognized that power belonged to God, not to himself, and that without divine help, he was nothing. His final prayer was not one of arrogance, but of dependence, a cry from a man who had been broken, but had not been abandoned. In his weakness, he rediscovered the true source of his strength. When Samson pushed against the pillars of the Philistine temple, bringing it down upon himself and his enemies, it was both a tragic and redemptive act. He gave his life in that moment, but in doing so, he fulfilled the purpose God had set for him from the beginning, to begin delivering Israel from the Philistines. His death accomplished what his life, with all its compromises, could not fully achieve. Out of his defeat came victory, out of his brokenness came redemption. Samson's final act reveals that God's mercy extends even to those who fail. Though he had squandered much of his calling, God still heard his cry and answered. This does not erase the consequences of his choices, but it shows that God can redeem even the most broken situations for his purposes. Samson's end becomes a testimony that no failure is too great for God to use, no defeat so final that his plan cannot bring good from it. This redemption in defeat carries a powerful message for anyone who has fallen, who feels broken by past choices or weighed down by failure. Samson's story shows that turning back to God is never too late, that even in the darkest circumstances, he can restore strength and bring purpose. What seems like the end can become the very place where God's power is revealed most clearly. Samson's death also reminds us that true strength is not found in living without weakness, but in surrendering weakness to God. In his final moment, Samson had no physical sight, no freedom, no dignity, yet he had faith. And with that faith, God worked mightily through him one last time. His life teaches that redemption does not come from our strength, but from God's willingness to hear us when we cry out in humility. The story of Samson ends with both tragedy and hope. Tragedy, because of what could have been if he had lived faithfully. Hope, because even in failure, God brought victory. His redemption in defeat stands as a reminder that our failures do not define the final word, and that even broken lives can become vessels of God's purpose when turned back to Him. Samson's story closes with a lesson that stretches beyond his time, a call to guard the source of strength with unwavering devotion. His life shows us that strength does not rest in physical might, talent, or personal willpower, but in the presence of God. When his devotion was intact, no enemy could overcome him. But when he allowed compromise to erode his consecration, he was left vulnerable. The key lesson is that strength must be protected because it is not self-generated, but entrusted by God for His purpose. Guarding strength begins with recognizing its true source. Samson often treated his gift as though it belonged to him, something he could use at will without consequence. Yet his downfall revealed that his strength was entirely dependent on his relationship with God. For us today, this means acknowledging that everything we have, whether gifts, opportunities, or influence, is given by God and must be used in faithfulness to Him. When the source is forgotten, the gift loses its power. Another truth we learn is that devotion must be constant, not occasional. Samson's struggles came when he drifted from his vow, when he lived as though his consecration could be set aside for personal desires. Guarding the source of strength means walking daily in faithfulness, not assuming that past victories guarantee future security. Devotion is not something to visit in moments of need, but to carry continually as the foundation of life. The story also emphasizes the danger of underestimating compromise. Samson did not fall in a single moment, but through a series of small decisions that weakened his resolve until the final collapse. Guarding strength requires vigilance, cutting off what threatens devotion before it takes root. The small compromises left unchecked become the cracks through which strength leaks away. Protecting what God has entrusted requires determination to guard even the seemingly small areas of life. Guarding the source of strength also means surrounding oneself with influences that build up rather than tear down. Samson chose relationships that drew him away from God's will, and those choices contributed to his downfall. For us, the people and influences we allow close to our hearts play a powerful role in shaping our devotion. To guard strength is to choose wisely, to keep what is harmful at a distance, and to remain steadfast in what honors God. Samson's final act shows us that even when strength has been lost, it can be renewed through humility and dependence on God. His cry for strength in the temple of the Philistines was answered, not because he deserved it, but because God is merciful and willing to restore those who turn back to Him. This truth reminds us that guarding strength is not about being flawless, but about continually returning to the source, acknowledging weakness, and seeking God's sustaining presence. The lesson of Samson's life is not only about the tragedy of what was lost, but the hope of what can be restored. His story calls us to guard our devotion carefully, to value the sacred trust God has placed in us, and to walk faithfully in the strength He provides. True power is not in what we achieve outwardly, but in the unseen connection between our hearts and the God who empowers us. Samson's story may have ended in death, but its message continues to speak to every generation. Guarding the source of your strength is essential, for without it, even the strongest will fall. With it, even the weakest can stand, for the power of God is made perfect in human weakness. His life is both a warning and an encouragement, urging us to remain faithful, to resist compromise, and to hold fast to the source of strength that never fails. Samson's journey shows us the cost of compromise, the danger of misplaced trust, the persistence of temptation, and the hope of redemption even in defeat. It reminds us that strength is not ours alone, but a gift that must be guarded, honored, and used faithfully. His story urges us to walk carefully, to remain devoted, and to remember that no matter our failures, God is still able to restore when we turn back to Him with humility. If this message has spoken to your heart, I invite you to support this channel so more people can hear reflections like these. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment with your thoughts or reflections on Samson's story. And if you know someone who might be encouraged or challenged by this message, share it with your friends and family so they too can reflect on the lessons we can learn from the life of Samson.